Who was Buddy Holly's rock and roll nemesis? Why, no other than Norman Petty, legendary producer, today on another vinyl show. Ike Frazier Industries presents another vinyl show with Ike Frazier. Hey everybody, it's your old pal Ike Frazier. I hope you guys will enjoy this first ever rock and roll villain episode on Norman Petty, Buddy Holly's nemesis. And if you like what you see, give us a like, leave a comment, and tell us who you think is a rock and roll villain. And if you can, subscribe. That helps us out a lot. We got some more subscribers this week, and that's really exciting. Every subscriber helps, as they say. But we hope you enjoy the story. And like I said, who is your rock and roll villain? We'll see you next time, and thanks for watching. Enjoy the film. Rock and roll villain, Norman Petty. Norman Petty was born in the small town of Clovis, New Mexico, and when he graduated high school, he was drafted into the United States Air Force. But when he got out of the United States Air Force, he connected back again with his high school sweetheart Vi, and they got married. And they started a band together when they moved back to Clovis, New Mexico, called Norman Petty Trio, with Vi on the piano and Norman on the organ and Jack Vaughn on the guitar. And they played around, especially on military bases. And so they decided to press up their own records to sell at their shows. And one of the songs that they recorded was Mood Indigo. Well, they hit pay dirt with this one because Mood Indigo went on to sell $500,000 in sales when RCA Records picked it up on their new pop label, X Records. Now, X Records only lasted for a very small time, and a lot of the releases are related to Norman Petty in some ways. And as he kept working and making money, he took all the money that he had earned from that success, almost $100,000, and he invested that in his own Norman Petty Studios. And so he got all of the money from that with the Norvajack Publishing that he put in the same building. So he had his publishing company and his recording studio and business offices all in the same building in Clovis, New Mexico. And they were very popular for a while, and Cashbox Records magazine had named them the most promising artist of 1954. And so they went on to have some smaller hits after a while, and as their popularity waned, Norman decided that he could record other artists and make a profit doing that. And he would record those songs by the song instead of by the hour. So he would give the artist a relaxed atmosphere, and he started all of his recordings from that point in his Norman Petty Studios. But he didn't have an echo chamber, so he needed an echo chamber, and fortunately for him, down the line in Lubbock, Texas, there was the Holly Tile Company, and they were more than glad to help him build that. And one of the first artists that he put out in the rock and roll vein was Sonny West, and that was Rockola Ruby. It was not quite a success. But then the Teen Kings, featuring Roy Orbison, came and recorded their song Ooby Dooby at the Norman Petty Studios, and the success that they did in their live shows led a very small independent label called Jewel to put those out, and there was about 1,000 copies of those pressed. And Sam Phillips heard that over the radio, and he was very impressed by it. And he said, "You bring Roy Orbison to Memphis." And they re-recorded the song and put it out on Sun Records. And it went, from January 1956. It took it a little while, but it charted all the way up at number 59 on the pop charts. And so Roy Orbison, from that point on, he was in Memphis and was a Sun recording artist. But some of his friends who had worked with him back at the KDDD radio station, like Buddy Knox and Jim Bowen, he suggested that they go to Norman Petty because Norman Petty had recorded the original version of Ooby Dooby. So Jim Bowen and Buddy Knox went to the Norman Petty Studios in Clovis, New Mexico, and each did one song, and they put it out on a 45 where each of them had a song on each side. So, with the success of their local shows, Roulette Records picked up Party Doll, and it became a #1 single. But in the meantime, Buddy Holly had already been dropped from Decca Records and he was looking for a new start. So he took his band, the Crickets, to Norman Petty Studios in Clovis, New Mexico, and they started to record there. But as those sessions were going on later in the year, Norman Petty had a hit with Almost Paradise in 1957, and that charted all the way up at number 17, I believe, on the pop charts. Well, with all that going on, the Crickets were on tour when their first album came out, and Norman Petty gave himself 9 songwriting credits on that first record. 9. Sometimes Buddy's name was taken off of songs and Norman Petty's added. Sometimes the drummer or the bass player's name was added. Roy Orbison had Norman Petty's name added to the songs that he had given Buddy Holly to record. And you'll see here that the Peggy Sue original 45, that we all know Peggy Sue was written by Buddy Holly has no songwriting credit on that 45. When his solo album came out, 7 songs had a Norman Petty credit on it. And Norman Petty told Sonny West, he was like, well, if you want Buddy to record Ray Vaughan, you have to give me a third of the songwriting on that. And here's the original That'll Be the Day album, no Norman Petty credit on there. But when they released the single, he made sure that he got his name added to that. Now you see, even when Sonny West released that single, Ray Vaughan, by himself, it still had a Norman Petty credit on there. Moon Dreams, his wonderful album, concept album from 1958. Buddy Holly plays guitar on that. The big money man was on his way. Everything was going his way. He took all the money that Buddy Holly got from the Decca recordings, which wasn't as much as it was from Coral or from Brunswick, and had all those funds transferred straight into his bank account. No Cricket was allowed to see how much money they were making. The touring money had to be put into his bank account. That was until Maria Elena came along and became the band's tour secretary. And she only sent Norman Petty his commission. She didn't send him all the money. She gave the Crickets their money. And he was furious because all that money was supposed to go to his bank account. And so Nicky Sullivan said that touring is just no way to live, and he was pretty fed up with it. And after all of the touring and television appearances and studio time and writing songs, he just quit. It just wasn't worth it to him anymore. So he went to Norman Petty, and Norman Petty gave him $1,000 and said, that's all you get for your record sales, your publishing, and your tour money. And 10% of that needs to go to the church, by the way. But he never gave the church a dime. And when Buddy Holly got married, he married a pretty shrewd lady, because Maria was a secretary for Peer and Southern, that was a big publishing company in New York City. And when she started going over Buddy Holly's books and all the paperwork and the receipts she was going over, she noticed that Norman Petty was keeping a lot of money for himself as expenses. So going over this with Buddy and his parents, they decided that they would go to Clovis, New Mexico, and confront Norman Petty about the money that was owed to Buddy, as well as severing all contractual ties with him because they felt like they had been cheated by him. He took so much money from them in publishing, in songwriting credits, in tour money, and his commissions. So he told them, Buddy, I'd rather see you dead than give you the money now. So they went back to New York City, and there's their apartment complex right there. And there, unfortunately, Buddy made some of his last home recordings and decided to go on the Winter Dance Party. And we all know the story about the Winter Dance Party. It's got Ritchie Valens and the Big Bopper and Dion and the Belmonts, and obviously the star of the show is Buddy Holly, because he's a star. And so as that tour winds and grinds through the wintry northern Midwest, they end up at the Surf Ballroom. And on February 2nd, 1959, they play a show there. And fed up with those cold buses, after the show, they decide they're going to charter a plane. And they're going to fly to the next show.
Interrupt this program for a special news bulletin. 3 young singers who soared to the heights of show business on the current rock and roll craze were killed today in the crash of a light plane in an Iowa snow flurry. The singers were identified as Richie Valens, 17, Buddy Holly, 22, and J.P. Richardson.
And the pilot, Roger Peterson, who is often forgot about because we lost 3 big stars that day. Now, when the news came on the TV in New York, Maria Elena had no idea what was going on and passed out and had a miscarriage and lost her and Buddy's child. And back in Lubbock, Buddy's mother fell down on the floor in hysterics. And Buddy was laid to rest on February 7th, 1959. And of course, Norman Petty was not there. He was busy back at the Norvajack Norman Petty Studios getting the Buddy Holly story ready for Coral Records, the first Buddy Holly compilation. That record was released 25 days after Buddy Holly died and went to number 11 in the United States and number 2 in the UK. Now, these were a lot of Buddy's greatest hits, and Norman decided, well, what am I going to do? I don't really have that much more Buddy Holly material. He goes to Buddy's parents, Elena and Lawrence, and was like, what tapes do you guys have? And he goes to New York to Buddy and Maria's apartments and gets some of Buddy's last home recordings, including Peggy Sue Got Married, Crying, Waiting and Hoping, songs that we all know, and he took those back to his studio. And he got the local band, the Fireballs, who got their name from playing a Jerry Lee Lewis song, guess which one, and they fixed those tapes up. And that was released as Buddy Holly Story Volume 2. And when that record came out, 15 months after Buddy died, it went to UK number 7, but did not chart in the US. He put the Fireballs back to work, recording more tapes that he had got from Decca and other places, and released it as Reminiscent in February of '63. And that record actually charted in the United States at number 40, and in the UK it went all the way to number 2. And at the height of Beatlemania here in America, May 1964, we released Buddy Holly Showcase. But here in America, nothing. The UK, number 3. Holly in the Hills, some of the earliest tapes released in January '65 with overdubs, did not chart in the United States, but only went to number 13 in the UK. In 1973, Alan Klein was basically on a month-to-month contract with Apple Records, just waiting to get the axe. And he was looking to get his fingers into other things, and Paul McCartney, also wanting to get some investments going on, had talked to his lawyer, Lee Eastman, about publishing. Well, Lee Eastman told him that Buddy Holly's things were for sale, but that Alan Klein was interested in purchasing those, and that the powerful Warner Chappell Publishing was also interested. So Paul McCartney anteed up a lot more money than Klein and Warner were willing to give, and Norman Petty could not resist, and he sold Norvajack Publishing to Paul McCartney in February of 1973. And it would hit the news, and everybody was very excited. And while all of that was going on, John Lennon was making his rock and roll album in LA with Phil Spector, which are some famous sessions all unto themselves. And when the sessions were over and the album finally came out in 1975, John Lennon got the record and he was looking at it and noticed that Peggy Sue was owned by Paul McCartney. And he said, well, Paul's going to make more money on this record than I am. But Norman Petty wasn't quite done yet. He had plans for a synthesizer Buddy Holly record in the 80s until he was diagnosed with leukemia and died at the age of 57 in 1984. He had a net worth of $132,000 when he died, but the Norman Petty studio today still acts as a shrine to Norman Petty and to Buddy Holly at the same time. So they're still making money off of Buddy Holly to this day. And when Buddy Holly died, he was just age 22, a young man expecting a baby and a bright future. His net worth was $150,000 at the time of death, but as we know, he was a little tight on cash. Now, Maria was getting all of her publishing from McCartney, but she noticed she wasn't getting any money from MCA, and she sued them and Petty for a whopping $251,000, but then the court decided also that Norman Petty's estate should receive some of that money. And so yet again, he was making money off of Buddy. Here's Buddy's last release in 2018, True Love Ways, the Buddy Holly and Philharmonic collaboration, number 10 in the UK. What are Norman Petty's records worth? Well, to me, they are absolutely worthless. That's just some mood music you can listen to. Norman Petty is our rock and roll villain, our inaugural episode. All we can say is that we really, really miss Buddy, and we give this video to him in a loving memory, and we want you all to rave on to some rock and roll, and we thank you for watching.